Welcome to episode number 2 of the Tactic Puzzle Speedrun series. In the previous episode, we started off with a rating of 400 on the climb all the way up to a 3000 plus rating. So the previous episode, we started at 400, we went all the way up to 600. In this episode, we are going to be starting off at 600, working our way up to 800. I'll be explaining my thoughts on the different puzzles that we take a look at throughout the course of the episode here. Hopefully you enjoy it. If you want to pause the video and solve the puzzles along with me, I think that would be very useful if you're in this rating range. That being said, let's go ahead and jump right into the puzzles here. So we're going to be starting off with a rating of 600. Let's go ahead and jump right into our first tactic here. So in this position here, our opponent has just played the move bishop takes f3. As mentioned in the previous episode of this kind of tactic speedrun series, always important to begin with the checks first, then the captures. Look for those options or opportunities that you have in the positions. And if we start off by looking at the checks in this position, there are a couple of different ones. There's a couple of spots that the queen can check on, whether it's g7 or g8. There's also this move bishop takes f6 check. And simply put, we can look at these two checks with the queen really quick. It looks like black will simply capture our queen, and that doesn't really do much for us. But the move bishop takes f6 check is looking pretty good. We hit the king in the corner. Black doesn't really have a way to move the king since our queen is protecting the squares on the g file. And so black will have to block with their own queen on the g7 square. We can capture the queen at that point. This is going to be the way to go. So we give the check, and the puzzle ends here because once the queen blocks, we would play queen takes g7 checkmate. Okay, rolling right into the next one. Once again, look for all the checks, then the captures. First of all, there's no captures available, but the checks are going to be a good place to begin with. There are two different check opportunities on the square d4. Either one of the rooks can move there. And I would just say, generally speaking, it makes a lot more sense for the rook that's not really doing a whole lot on d8 to be the one that gives the check on d4. The rook on d3 is doing a pretty good job of covering a couple of important squares from the opponent's king. So here it's really just going to be about the rook on d8 coming up to d4, and this is going to be a checkmate in one move. So that is going to be the end of the game. And so that would be checkmate. So let's continue from here. So black has just made the move queen to e1. They are threatening queen takes f1 with checkmate, which would be a very big problem for us. However, the nice thing about this is that it is our move. We can play whatever we want to do in this position. And it's important here that, maybe in a game, if you didn't know that this was a puzzle, in a game you might think something like, oh, I need to defend against black's idea. But it's usually good to look for your own forcing moves, again, your own checks, your own captures first, before looking for defensive options. And if you begin by looking at the checks here, you will see that queen h7 check, king f8, queen takes f7 does deliver a checkmate because the knight will be protecting the queen on that f7 square. So we check, and then checkmate. Checking on h8 wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense. The king would get to escape. Checkmating, of course, is better than checking, and it does get the job done here. So that's it for that one. Let's continue along. So here white just played the move knight to g5. They are up a piece in this position. So in terms of things that we are going to be working towards at this point, we're either going to be working towards winning material, aka winning the knight or more material in this position, or we're going to be looking for checkmates. And again, not to repeat too much, but you're going to hear it all the time. We always want to start with checks first. And it ends up here that we have a familiar pattern. If you watch the first episode of the Tactic Speedrun series, you would have seen this pattern occur, I think, at least 2 different times in the previous video. We have the ability here to play the move queen to f2 with check, protected by the rook on f8. The king would have to move to the h1 square. And then when the king is stuck in the corner, there's 2 pawns in front of the king. There start to become some back rank checkmate possibilities. And it does end up in that position that we'd be able to play queen f1 check. The rook takes the queen, but we do have the rook on f8 that would be able to recapture on f1, and that would actually deliver the checkmate here. So we did see this pattern in the first episode, and it is a familiar pattern. We could still figure out the answer without knowing the pattern, but knowing the pattern does make life a bit easier. Okay, let's keep going along. All right, so once again, checks, captures, then threats. Checks and captures especially are going to be the key answer to large majority of puzzles in this rating range. So what checks can we make? We can play the move rook to g1 check, and we can make the move bishop takes f3 with check. These are the two different checks that are available. We do have this bishop on a7 that's important to note in this situation. It is very far away from the king side, but nonetheless, the bishop is a long-range piece. So that means the bishop, even though it's all the way on a7, it is actually influencing the king side half of the board here. So that is something to keep an eye on. So for example, if we try to play the move rook g1 check, white cannot take with the king in this position because the bishop is protecting the rook, but white would be able to play the move rook takes g1. If we try to look for follow-up checks at that point, there is the move bishop takes f3 check. However, once the rook is on g1 for white, they are able to block with their rook on the g2 square. And we really have given up quite a lot of material. We gave up the entire rook. And even if we take the rook back on g2, white will recapture with their king. And we're really just going to be down a rook in that position, which is bad news for us. So checking on g1 first doesn't look great. However, if we look at the other alternative from the starting point, which was bishop takes f3 check first, it's a very important calculation technique, I guess you could say, that you can use when you're looking to solve different tactic puzzles or calculation puzzles. It's very important that even if you're not finding the right sequence of moves on first glance, so we were looking at rook g1 check and then bishop takes f3, one of the best things you can do in these types of positions is to change the order of moves around. So maybe instead of playing rook g1 check first, what if we play bishop takes f3 check first, then rook g1 check afterwards? And that does end up being the key to this particular puzzle. If we play bishop takes f3 check, the rook has to take, and then rook to g1 is checkmate at that point because the rook is no longer on the f1 square. So we have the right kind of pieces to the puzzle, or the right recipes or ingredients for the recipe, you could say. Bishop takes f3 and rook g1. We just have to put them into the pot in the right order here. So it is bishop takes f3 check, then rook to g1 is a checkmate. Okay, we go to the next one. Once again, checks, then captures. You usually want to look at it in that order. In terms of checks, we have two different checks with the rook. We have a couple of different knight checks. The knight checks look like black will just take the pieces for free. I don't really see the point behind those. And rook f7 check, the rook will capture on f7. However, if we go rook to g8, this ends up being checkmate because the rook on g1 is supporting that rook on g8, and the knight's covering the f7 square. And other than that, black does not have any available squares to move away to, and thus rook to g8 is going to be checkmate. Okay, so white just played the move pawn to b4. They are attacking the queen on the c5 square. So we're most likely going to need to react to that, or we're going to need to make a forcing move, again, a check or a capture of our own. So what kind of checks can we give here? There's actually two different options for checks. I suppose technically three. There's two different queen checks, f2 and e3. And there's also a knight check with knight to d4, but that looks like it just gets captured by the pawn. And queen e3 check gets captured by the bishop. And so here it is going to be the move queen to f2. This does deliver checkmate, mainly because the queen is supported by the knight, and the king has no escape squares to go away to. So we get the checkmate there. Okay, here here black just played the move rook to c2. And so we ask first, again, any checks, and then any captures. So in this position here, in terms of checks, we have a queen sacrifice, a different queen sacrifice. We can take on h7 or on e6. Both of these deliver a check. But it doesn't really feel like we're going to be sacrificing the queen. I mean, you could do queen takes h7 check, and then maybe you follow up with another check on d3, and the king moves away somewhere. And, you know, if you're giving up a queen, you really need to either be delivering checkmate or winning a real large amount of material in return. If we take the rook on c2 after the queen sacrifice and the bishop check, we're really just coming out at a net negative at that point. So the checks in this position don't end up working out. They don't end up leading to a whole lot special for us. And in terms of captures, the only other capture that we haven't looked at that wasn't a check was it would be the move rook takes d5. But as far as I can tell, the bishop just takes there, and I don't really see anything special about that. So this is our first puzzle, at least in this episode, that's not going to revolve around a check or a capture on the first move of the game, but it is going to revolve around a threat. So when you're looking for threats in positions that aren't checks and captures, what you're wanting to do is to identify pawns, pieces, or squares, mostly pawns and pieces, in the opponent's territory, or among the opponent's kind of pawns and pieces, that are either undefended or attacked and defended an equal number of times. Those would kind of be what I would call tactical weaknesses or tactical targets, or soft spots in the opponent's position. Um, so it ends up in this position here that if we're looking across the board from left to right, in terms of things that are undefended, there's a bishop on b7, a rook on c2, and the queen on e8. These are all undefended here. And then in terms of things that are attacked and defended the same number of times, the knight on d5 doesn't count. We are attacking it once, but it's defended 2 times, so that does not qualify. The pawn on e6 doesn't count. It's attacked once and defended 2 times. But the pawn on h7 does count. It is attacked once by our queen and defended once by the king. So we have these 4 kind of highlighted spots in our opponent's position. 3 undefended pieces, and then kind of a soft spot on h7. And what we want to do here is figure out, do we have anything that's already lining up towards or attacking one of these things in the first place? And can we look to attack multiple highlighted pieces or highlighted pawns or what have you in this kind of situation? So we don't really have a whole lot aiming against really any of the pieces. We do have the pawn on h7 that is being attacked already by the queen, so I would almost kind of emphasize that in the position. This feels like it might be something we can take advantage of. And if we think about ways to attack this h7 pawn a second time, we actually will see that there's a way to attack the h7 pawn and to attack another one of the undefended things in black's position at the same time. And that's with the move bishop to d3. This attacks the pawn a second time, because the bishop on d3 is helping, but this also attacks the rook on c2 at the same moment when the bishop is on the d3 square. And simply put, there's really not a great way for black to solve both of those problems simultaneously. If they move the rook away, we'll take the pawn. If they move the pawn, we'll take the rook. They don't really have any checks or counterattacking moves of their own all that much. And so bishop to d3 is going to be a very strong move in this position that's going to pose a ton of problems for black. So that's going to be the move. The computer ends up giving the response pawn to g6. This does block off the attack on the h7 pawn, but this does nothing about the rook on c2. Here we can simply capture the rook, and now we went from being equal on material to now being in a position where we're up an entire rook, and that's going to help us to win the game in the future. So this was a really nice puzzle. It's kind of a simple fork, you could call it, but it's very important to think through or kind of figure out how to process these types of positions rather than just throwing out the first move you see. I'm mainly trying to show how you could think through these positions and recreate this thinking process rather than just, oh, this is the move, you play it, you do this, you do that, trying to kind of systematize the things that we're looking at. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So here black just played the move bishop to d1. They are attacking the queen on f3. What checks do we have available? We have a couple of different queen checks on the f file. We have a rook check on g7. We have a rook check on c8. Of all of these things, the one that looks the safest, the one that's not going to lose material right at the start, is going to be the queen on f7. It is supported by the rook. And once the king goes in the corner and the queen's already on the f7 square, the rook and queen form a battery along the 7th rank. We can slide the queen over one more square to the right, capture the pawn on g7, and then deliver checkmate there. So queen f7 check, and queen takes g7 checkmate. Okay, here white just captured a pawn on h6. Again, we always start off with the checks, the captures, then the threats in that order specifically. What checks do we have? We have a couple of different queen checks on h1, g1, and g2. It ends up that taking on g2 is supported by the bishop that's also attacking the g2 pawn. So this is simply going to be checkmate in this position. White has nowhere to move the king to, and that is going to be the end of the game. Okay, we keep going. Again, checks, captures, threats. In terms of the checks, we have a couple of different checks available with the queen. We can check on h1, but that gets captured by the bishop. We can check on g1, but that gets captured by the king. We can check on h3, which is technically safe. g2 is going to get captured, and we can also take on f2. Now, the nice thing is it's kind of similar to the previous position where we just took the pawn on g2. When you're looking for certain captures or things to do, especially if you're trying to check the king, usually you want the check to be as close to the king as possible, especially if you're like on the square next to the king or you're kind of touching the king in that sense. You could also call it like a contact check. In this particular case, as well as the previous example, we are able to deliver a contact check. And a contact check pretty much just means that there's no way to block the check. If I do a check from the f2 square, white cannot put something between the f1 and f2 squares. It just doesn't exist. There's no f 0.5 or something like that. Or I guess it would be f1.5. No, it would be like f1.5 if we were capturing if there was something between f1 and f2. So that's not how the game works, of course. And so this is what's known as a contact check. It's also checkmate, of course. But usually you want to look for kind of the contact checks first, because as mentioned in the previous episode, usually when you're looking for the check or forcing move options, you want to start with the options that give the opponent the least amount of responses. A contact check takes away the option of blocking the check, so it gives white less options that are available. Whereas if we compare that to something like queen h3, they could block with the bishop or move the king. So it's a bit of a long-winded explanation as to why queen takes f2 is a checkmate and how to look for that check, kind of how to rank that check in our list of which ones do we look at first, second, third, and so on and so forth. But it does end up being checkmate here. Okay, black just played the move queen to d4. And here we're seeing another familiar pattern. We've seen this pattern already once during this episode and a couple of times in the previous episode. We have pressure with the rook and the queen lining up towards the f7 pawn. Move that away. Lining up towards the f7 pawn. If we take on f7, it's the only check that's available in the position. The king would have to go in the corner. And we have this familiar pattern of checking on the f8 square. The rook has to take. We recapture with our rook. And we do deliver this back rank checkmate. So we are going to play the move. Oop, there it is. Sorry. We're going to now play the move queen to f8 check. The rook takes. Sorry, computer got a little bit slow there for some reason. But yeah, so we get the checkmate there. Okay, so along to the next puzzle here. So white just played this move, knight to c3. And so in this position, we again look for checks, captures, and then threats. We have two different checks that are available in this position. We can play the move bishop takes c3, which would be a check, and the move queen takes e4, which is also a check. Now, if we play queen takes e4, we're going to get captured by the knight, so that doesn't look so good. If we play bishop takes c3, white can recapture the bishop on c3. That's pretty much just a neutral trade. We lose a bishop, they gain. We gain a knight, then lose a bishop. 3 points for 3 points. That's a neutral trade. But the nice thing about the move bishop takes c3 check is it does eliminate the knight that was protecting that pawn on e4 in the first place. So once that knight's gone, then we can play the move queen takes e4 check safely at that point, because there's no knight on c3. And once we are taking the pawn on e4 and the knight's gone, we are also attacking not only the king, but also the bishop on c4 at the same time. And so no matter how white reacts to the check, we can capture the bishop afterwards, and we're going to be in very nice shape there. So it's another sequence of checks. Check on c3 with the trade, take on e4 with check, and then we can pick up the bishop on c4 that is undefended in the position. Okay, let's keep going along. So here black just played the move pawn to d3. Again, checks, captures, threats. We look for the checks first. So there is queen to a8 check, queen to e8 check, bishop takes f7 check, and queen takes h7 check. Now in terms of the options, queen takes h7, probably not going to be the best way to do things. Giving up the queen when there's so few pieces left on the board is very unlikely to work. Bishop takes f7 check maybe is an option, but keep in mind we are down the exchange or down material in the first place. So if we were giving the bishop up, we would really need to be winning the rook on c1 in some manner afterwards, or we'd have to be delivering checkmate to be worth the investment there. I don't really see the follow-up. There's a few checks after bishop takes f7 check. If the king does take on f7, there's a few checks available, but none that are going to attack the rook on c1 or deliver checkmate as far as I can tell. So this leaves the other two checks on a8 and e8 available. Against both of these moves, the opponent is pretty much going to have to block with their queen on the f8 square. So I would probably first lean towards the option that is closest to the king as possible, maybe is how I would word it at this point. If both of the moves are going to be met by the queen blocking on f8, I'd probably start by looking at the check on e8 to begin with. And if the queen does block on f8, now we ask again, do we have any follow-up checks, captures, or threats, especially checks and captures? If we trade the queens, we're down material, so that's probably not the way to go. But we do actually have the bishop takes f7 option available once our queen is on e8 and their queen is on f8. Their queen is not able to capture our bishop on f7 because it is pinned on the back rank. So our queen, remember, their queen is on f8, our queen is on e8. Their queen cannot move off of the f8 square easily without us hitting the king in the process. So if we check on e8, the queen blocks, then bishop takes f7 check. Black can also not take the bishop because the queen on e8 is protecting the bishop. So the king would have to move into the corner, which means that the queen on f8 is no longer protected at that point. And that would be a checkmate in that position. So we can go queen to e8, bishop takes f7 check. The queen cannot take because it was being pinned. And then we can take the queen on the f8 square with checkmate. Okay, next position. White just played the move bishop f4. They are attacking our queen on e5. So again, we start with checks first. Do we have any checks in this position? I don't see any checks available. I don't see a way to attack white's king on g1 with this specific move. So then we move on to captures. Do we have any captures that can be made? If we're going to be looking at captures in a position like this, especially when our opponent just made a threat with their own move, this bishop f4 move attacking our queen, if we're going to be making a capture that's not a check, the capture needs to be kind of at least at an equal strength of what the opponent is threatening in the first place. So for example, we can play knight takes g3, that's a capture, but white's going to take our queen. Like, knight takes g3, they take our queen, like we didn't gain anything out of this. If anything, we just lost the queen at that point. Same thing if we take on f2, they're just going to take our queen. They don't need to take the knight. The queen is more important for them to capture. There is a different capture in this position, though, that does make a threat or make a high-value attack at the same time, and that is the move knight takes c3. If we capture the knight in this manner, we're also attacking the queen that's on the a4 square. So if we take their knight, if they take our queen, we get their queen, right? We took a knight, they got a queen, we got a queen, so we're actually still up a knight in that kind of sequence. The knight on a4 is safe, white cannot capture it, and if they take our bishop on d6, we've also got that bishop on d6 protected. So it's looking pretty good right now to take the knight if they take our queen. Now the other option, of course, is what if they don't take our queen? What if they just recapture on c3 with their knight? Well, once our knight on e4 is out of the way, and also once white's knight on c3 is gone, we do have this discovered attack or this lineup towards this undefended bishop that would be on e2. Right now the bishop is defended because the knight on c3 is on the board, but if we eliminate the knight, then the bishop will no longer be protected. And so it does end up that knight takes c3. If white recaptures, we get this bishop on e2 with an extra piece. And if they take our queen, we get their queen, and we're also going to be ahead an extra piece in that position. So this is starting to get a little more complicated on the tactics, but this is a very nice one. We take on c3. In this case, they take our queen. We take theirs. They took our bishop. We have the pawn protecting there. We can recapture. And now we are simply ahead a extra knight in this position, which is very good for us. Okay, let's keep going. So here, black just played the move queen to d2. Again, we start off with checks, captures, then threats. In terms of checks, we have queen to e6 check and queen takes g7 check. Queen takes g7 is a contact check, as we talked about earlier, so probably it's the one we would look at first. And it also ends up that the queen on g7 would be protected by the bishop. The bishop is also attacking g7, and so that would be a contact check that is protected, and the king also has nowhere to move at that point. So this would actually be a pretty quick one-move checkmate in this position. Okay, we keep going along. So in this position here, it's white's move. First things first, we're down a rook. So we're probably looking to win a lot of material, like win the opponent's queen somehow, or we're looking to deliver checkmate. Those are kind of the two primary goals, I would say, at this point. And so we have to figure out how we're going to try to do that from here. So again, we always start with checks first. There are checks on c4, b4 with the rook, c4 with the queen, e4 with the queen, d6 with the queen, f6, c7. For the most part, the two checks that I'm really focusing on in this position are either the rook going to c4 or the queen going to c4. Every other move is either going to lose us material, or in the case of queen e4 check, it's going to allow black to trade the queens. And keep in mind, we're down a rook at the start, so we're not trying to trade queens and lose out on our attacking chances at this point. So we have the options. The main options, I would say, are rook c4 and queen c4. Now, the question would be against either one of these, what is our opponent's options in response? Or which one gives them the least amount of options? And I would probably start there. So if we go queen to c4, black really only has two moves available. They can go to d6 or they can go to d7. If we go rook to c4, black has b6, b5, d7, d5. They have four different options. So it might very well be the case that rook c4 is the better move, but I'm going to start by looking at queen to c4 check first because it gives black less options. It makes my life a bit easier to calculate. If they have less options, and then I find that maybe it doesn't work out, then I go back to rook c4 and kind of widen the search. But if it does work out with queen c4, then I just save myself a lot of time. So queen to c4 check, the king has these two different moves available. Now, if the king goes to the d6 square, then we would ask what are some follow-up checks that are available. So we would be able to go back to f4, which doesn't really make a ton of sense. The king could go back to c6 if it wanted to, so I don't think going to f4 a second time would make a whole lot of sense. The rook on d3 is protected, so capturing the rook doesn't really do much for us. In terms of queen checks, there's not really any great ones, but there is a nice rook check with rook to b6 check. That would attack the king that's on d6. Also, behind the king on the 6th rank is going to be the queen. So as soon as the king moves away, we could capture the queen. And that starts to look pretty good. The king moves away, we take the queen. Also, I will note, once the queen on g6 is gone, then that means that the rook on d3 will be unprotected. So that's also something that could be very good for us. So queen c4 check, king d6, rook b6, take the queen after the king moves. Life is looking pretty good. So again, this is if the king goes to d6. What if the king goes to d7? Well, in that case, we have some additional checks that are available. The main one I'm looking at is rook takes b7 check. The king would have to move another time. If it goes up to d6, we have the same rook to b6 idea, so that's looking good. If it goes to d8, it looks like we can give a contact check with queen to c7 check, king e8, and queen to e7 checkmate. That looks pretty good. And finally, if the king goes to e8, we don't have a great contact check necessarily, but we do have the move, I think, queen to c8. I guess there is rook to d8 there, so maybe let's see if there's any other options. So queen c4, king d7, rook takes b7, king e8. I think we might have queen to b5 check. If the king goes to f8, queen to c5 check, and then we're trying to get to the e7 square to deliver checkmate. But even there, I guess black can block with the queen. So I have a feeling this is the answer. Queen c4 check, king d7, rook takes b7, king e8. However, I'm trying to piece together the final part of this puzzle here. So check, d7, take b7, king e8. I might just be having a little bit of a blind spot here for whatever reason. There is rook to b8 check, but once again, black can block with their rook on d8. I still think, yeah, so I think it is actually, so queen c4, king d7, rook takes b7, king e8. I think queen to b5 check, king f8, queen to c5 check. If the queen blocks on d6, then we have queen f5 check, king e8, queen f7 check, a contact check. The king moves to d8, and then I can finally take the rook on g8 once because the queen has moved to the d6 square. So I know it's a bit long-winded. I'm not actually sure if the computer is going to give these responses, quite honestly, but yeah, I think it's going to be queen to c4 check here. Okay, the computer gives kind of the easier answer, I would say. I think king to d7 is a little bit trickier. Here we're going to go rook to b6 check. We are going to take the queen. I don't think taking the pawn will do much when black can block with the rook, so I think we're taking the queen. And then once they recapture, then the rook on d3 is free to be captured in that circumstance. So I'm pretty sure if the king had gone to d7, we were going to play rook takes b7 and go from there. Yeah, that's going to be that one. Let's go ahead to the next one. So here black just captured something on f6. It's our move as white here. And so in terms of checks, we can play queen takes g3 check or rook to g4 check. I don't think we need to sacrifice the queen for the rook. And also, if checking on g4 with the rook, they're going to take the rook with the queen. So I don't think any of the checks are going to work right now, as far as I can tell. In terms of captures, the only other captures are to take the pawn on e4 or pawn on f6. We cannot capture the queen on h3 right now because the pawn on g2 is pinned, so that's not really a possibility. Taking on e4 also doesn't really make a lot of sense because black will simply recapture the rook. So rook takes f6 for the moment is looking best. And we do set up some ideas of rook to f8 check, which is quite dangerous for the opponent to deal with. In terms of other forcing moves in this position, I'm not really seeing any great threats at this point. We could play rook h4 to attack the queen, but black is going to capture there. So I'm leaning towards the move being rook takes f6 check, and I think simply put, black doesn't really have a great way to stop the move rook to f8, which will involve a couple of contact checks and a very dangerous attack against black's king. So I think we're taking the pawn. They end up capturing on g2 with check. We have really only one option. We have to take with the queen. We have to take again. Here we're just ahead of rook with a winning material advantage that we're happy about. Okay, let's keep going. So here black just played the move queen to h1. We want to look for our checks first, then our captures. So in terms of checks, we have a couple of checks on the back rank, but black does have those protected with the rook. We can check on c5, and we can also check on d6. If you think about which of these two moves we would focus on, I would be prioritizing queen to d6 check because not only is it attacking the king that's on the f8 square, but it's also attacking the rook that's on the b8 square. And so queen to d6 check, the king cannot move to the e8 square since our bishop covers that square. The king would have to move to g8. That's the only legal move. And then we can take the rook on b8, and that will be a checkmate because of this back rank type of pattern that we've seen before. So check on d6, take on b8. We do get the checkmate, and we win the game. Okay, here white just captured a piece on f5. It's up to us as black to figure out what we're going to play. We start with checks, then captures as usual. In terms of checks, we have bishop takes h2 check. That is a contact check. We have queen to g5 check and knight to f3 check. All three of these are checks in the position. Now, I will also note a knight check is also what you could call a contact check as well. It's not really, touching the king. It's not like right next to it. But a knight check cannot be blocked. You can't block a check from a knight. You can't block an attack from a knight. It's just not a possibility in chess. So in terms of the moves I would look at first, quite honestly, it would be like bishop takes h2 check and knight f3 check, because the opponent has very few options in response. There's no blocking these checks. However, the problem is after something like knight f3 check, white's simply going to take with their queen, and I don't really see a great follow-up. And after bishop takes h2 check and the king takes, we have an additional check with our queen coming to the d6 square, but I think white can move the king to something like h3, and we kind of run out of good checks. So this leaves the final check that was left over, which is queen to g5 check. And here white has very few options. They can either move the king, which does allow us then to play another contact check, which is a checkmate with queen to g2, or they can try to block with their queen on g4, after which we'll just take the queen because it's undefended. So that's looking like the right answer. Queen to g5 check. The puzzle cuts off here, but if the king had moved, we would deliver mate, and if the queen had blocked, we would have taken the queen. Okay, so our move is black in this position here. White did just play the move bishop g5, which is attacking our rook on d8. However, keep in mind, we want to first look for our own checks, captures, and threats, our own forcing moves, before we feel like we need to react or reply with a defensive option. So what checks do we have available first? We have a contact check on d2. However, it looks like white will take back with the knight. I don't see anything special about that for us. And we have a couple of different knight checks that are available. Knight to g3 check, they'll just take us. But knight takes c3 check is looking like a decent idea. There is no way to capture the knight. The king has to move because it's a knight check. The only available square for the king is the e1 square. It cannot move up to the e3 square because the bishop covers that, and the rook covers all the squares on the d file. And once the king goes back to e1, we actually have another contact check. Technically, there's bishop takes f2, but the main one would be rook to d1, which would be a checkmate because the knight on c3 protects the rook at that point. So we take here and deliver the checkmate. Notice that we didn't really need to react to what white was doing with their whole bishop g5 idea because we could just make our own forcing moves that are more powerful and direct. Okay, we keep going along. Start with the checks, then the captures, then the threats. In terms of checks, the only one that I see is queen takes a2 check. After the king takes the queen, I really don't see a follow-up. We are investing a ton of material for just one check, which is not great. In terms of other captures that are available, there is pawn takes d4, but I don't really see a huge benefit behind that. It doesn't really do a whole lot special. It's just capturing a pawn. So I would actually kind of skip over the captures and look to see if there's any very dangerous threats that we could make at this point. So attacking like a queen, attacking an undefended piece, threatening checkmate, stuff like that. So rook to c6 is a pretty dangerous move in the sense that it attacks the queen, but white has, different ways they can move the queen. They can go to e7, f3, things like that. There is the option here of playing the move queen to a3, threatening a checkmate on the b2 square. And simply put, I don't really see a good way for white to stop that idea. If we get the queen to a3, they can only move the king to one square, but then queen to b2 would still be a contact check and checkmate. And there's really just no way that any of white's pieces can protect the b2 square. There's also no counter-attacking moves that white can really try here either. Any checks of their own will just simply capture the queen. So queen a3 is looking like the idea, and I don't really see a great answer for white. The computer gives a move where they just sacrifice the queen. Okay, we'll take the queen, and next move we can deliver checkmate on b2 because there's nothing white can do to prevent it. Okay, next puzzle. Start with the checks, then the captures, then the threats. The only check that I see is rook to e8 check at this point. The king has nowhere to move to, so black would have to block with their bishop or with their rook. And the nice thing about this is that if they block with the rook, we've got the bishop covering the f8 square, so we could always take the rook at that point. And if they block with the bishop on f8, we don't necessarily need to take the bishop right away because the bishop is pinned. What we could do, though, is we could capture the bishop on c8, which is an undefended piece in this position. And if we kind of rewind and take a look at the original position here, we are down a piece or down a bishop in this position, but we are ahead 2 pawns. We have 7 pawns to our opponent's 5. If I can win a bishop or win a minor piece here, then I'm going to go from being down a little bit of material to being up 2 pawns for free with a great position. So rook to e8 check, bishop blocks, rook takes c8. This is looking very good for us. The bishop cannot capture ours on h6 because it's pinned once again, and I think we're just going to be ahead those 2 pawns that were up in the first place without being down the bishop. So rook e8 check. We don't need to rush to take this. If we do rush, then the rook on f8 would kind of x-ray through our rook to protect the bishop on c8, and so we will just take the bishop on c8 right away. And yeah, that takes us right to our rating of 800, as you can see here. So that is going to do it for this episode here. We've worked our way up from 600 to 800, another 200 rating points on the tactic puzzle rating here. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. It had some educational value, of course, being based on getting the chance to solve these puzzles for yourself. Hopefully you were able to work through them as well. That's going to do it for this episode. I will see you around in the next one, and I'll talk with you again then.